He handed it to Samir with the same quiet dignity with which Sundar had once extended his hand across the chasm of pain and pride. "If you want," Arjun said, his voice steady and warm, "come by. We'll teach you. We'll help you build your dreams." Samir stared at the card, then at Arjun, disbelief warring with cautious hope in his young eyes. "Why?" he asked finally, the question raw, unfiltered. Arjun smiled, feeling the rain mixing with the warmth rising in his chest. "Because someone once did the same for me," he said, "and because I believe you're worth it." The boy's fingers closed around the card, clutching it like a lifeline. They sat in silence for a few minutes more, the rain washing the world clean around them. Eventually, Samir rose, nodded shyly, and walked away, toward home, toward possibility, toward a future he could not yet fully see but which had, in that simple moment, become a little closer, a little more real. Arjun watched him go, feeling not pride but a profound, humbling gratitude. For Sundar, for the journey, for every painful stumble that had led him to this bench, this rain-soaked crossroads where the torch could be passed once more. And as he stood up and turned toward home, Arjun understood with deep certainty that life's greatest victories are not the ones we hoard, but the ones we share, that every hand we lift from the dust, every voice we encourage to sing again, every light we kindle in another's darkness, becomes part of a fire that no hardship, no cruelty, no despair can ever extinguish. Thus the story continued, not in headlines or trophies, but in small, unbreakable acts of hope, passed hand to hand, heart to heart, lighting the world, one dreamer at a time. He had once been a boy mocked for his quiet nature, overlooked, pushed aside, laughed at. But now he understood that strength was never about shouting the loudest. It was about enduring, about lifting others even when your own arms ache, about shining light not on yourself, but on the path ahead for those still struggling in the dark. As he stood there, watching generations of hope and resilience fill the room, Arjun realized something profound. The story Sundar had started, and that he had carried forward, would not end with him. It would ripple outward, touching lives he would never meet, lighting fires in hearts he would never know. And in that endless chain of second chances, forgiveness, and faith, both he and Sundar had found something even greater than success. They had found legacy. The torch passed on. Years passed, as they always do, weaving time into a tapestry of memories, triumphs, lessons, and quiet moments that often go unnoticed by the world, but leave deep imprints on the soul. Arjun's work with Second Light continued to flourish beyond anything he had dared to dream in the early, uncertain days of its beginning. Thousands of students had passed through the program by now. Young men and women who had once seen themselves as invisible, now standing tall as software engineers, project managers, entrepreneurs, and most importantly, as believers in the transformative power of hope. Arjun himself had grown into a man whose reputation extended far beyond the technical skills he had once struggled so desperately to learn. He had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of resilience, proof that no life was ever beyond redemption if fueled by humility, hard work, and faith. Despite his growing influence and the increasing demands on his time, Arjun never lost touch with his roots. He insisted on teaching at least one beginner's class every few months, returning to the classroom to see in the nervous faces of his students the mirror of his own early struggles. He would walk among the rows of battered laptops and trembling hands, reminding them with every word, every gesture, that greatness was not measured by where you started, but by how fiercely you chose to climb when the world seemed determined to hold you down. One rainy afternoon, fitting, somehow, given how pivotal rainy days had been in his journey, Arjun found himself walking home from one of those classes, his mind heavy with a sense of restless anticipation. The streets were slick with water, neon reflections shimmering on the asphalt. As he passed a small bus stop, he noticed a young boy sitting alone, soaked through, clutching a plastic bag to his chest as though it were a shield. Something about the boy, Perhaps the way his head was bowed, or the silent misery that clung to him, tugged at Arjun's heart with a force he could not ignore. He slowed down, hesitated, then approached. The boy looked up, startled, his face wary, prepared for indifference, or worse, cruelty. He couldn't have been more than 14 or 15, skinny and pale, under the weight of circumstances far heavier than his small frame should have carried. "Are you all right?" Arjun asked, his voice gentle, the way Sundar's had been that day at the diner. The boy shrugged, clearly unaccustomed to kindness. After a long pause, he muttered, "Missed the bus. Lost my wallet." Arjun nodded, understanding far more than the boy realized. He sat down on the bench, ignoring the rain soaking through his clothes. "That's tough," he said simply, not pressing, not probing, just offering his presence like a small island of safety. Bit by bit, the story unfolded. The boy's name was Samir. His father had lost his job months ago. His mother worked double shifts just to keep food on the table. And Samir himself had dropped out of school recently to help make ends meet. He dreamed, though he said it so quietly it was almost a confession, of working with computers, of building apps and games, but such dreams felt as distant and unattainable as the stars glittering weakly behind the rain clouds. Listening, Arjun felt a deep ache stir within him, a resonance that transcended the years, reaching back to the boy he had once been, small, overlooked, dismissed by the world. He remembered how it felt to clutch a dream so fragile that speaking it aloud seemed dangerous, as though the mere weight of the words could shatter it. And in that moment, Arjun knew what he had to do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Not a business card like the one Sundar had given him long ago, but a small worn card bearing the logo of Second Light, and more importantly, a promise. Free classes, mentorship, the doorway into a future that the world had tried to convince this boy he did not deserve. Drawing on his newfound network and the credibility he had earned, Arjun launched a community initiative he called Second Light, a program aimed at offering free technical education, mentorship, and career guidance to youth from marginalized backgrounds. It was not a sleek, corporate initiative born in boardrooms and polished press releases. It was messy, raw, and rooted in real need. He started in local libraries and community centers, often using his own modest savings to rent small spaces, buy refurbished laptops, and print out learning materials. He reached out to local businesses for support, some of whom remembered him as the man who once cleaned tables and poured coffee with quiet dignity. The first sessions were small, a handful of hesitant teenagers and unemployed young adults who shuffled into borrowed rooms, eyes guarded, hopes flickering uncertainly. Many had dropped out of school. Some had never touched a computer before. Arjun saw in their faces the same blend of fear and yearning that had once stared back at him from the mirror. He did not greet them with lofty speeches or hollow promises. He greeted them with humility, with honesty, and with the unwavering belief that no mistake, no background, no poverty could permanently chain a human spirit that decided to rise. He taught them the basics at first, how to navigate an operating system, how to build a simple web page, how to understand the logic behind the code. But far more importantly, he taught them resilience. When their programs crashed, he showed them how to laugh instead of curse, how to see every error message not as a wall, but as a door asking to be opened differently. When they doubted themselves, he shared stories of his own failures, not sanitized, but in all their painful, awkward truth. He showed them that success was not reserved for the chosen few. It was stitched from the fabric of persistence, humility, and an unwavering refusal to surrender. Word spread slowly but steadily. Each small victory, a young woman building her first website, a teenager landing an internship, a shy student confidently presenting their project, sent ripples outward. More students came, then volunteers, then local tech companies offering refurbished equipment and small grants. What began as a few borrowed hours in dusty rooms evolved into a thriving movement, a living testament to the power of second chances, fueled not by pity, but by genuine empowerment. Throughout it all, Arjun never forgot the hand that had first pulled him from the tide of failure. He kept in touch with Sundar, sending quiet updates, not grand announcements, but humble notes filled with gratitude and shared pride. Sundar responded not with fanfare but with simple, powerful words of encouragement, always reminding Arjun that leadership was not measured by titles, but by the lives one touched and transformed. One evening, as Arjun locked up one of the community centers after a particularly lively coding workshop, he paused to watch the students laughing and chatting as they headed into the twilight. He felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment, deeper and more lasting than any paycheck or title could ever offer. In their eyes, he saw reflections of the boy he once was, and more importantly, he saw reflections of the men and women they would one day become. Leaders, creators, builders, not because someone had given them everything, but because someone had believed in their ability to reach for it themselves. The program soon expanded into other cities, with former students becoming mentors, continuing the cycle of hope and learning. Arjun traveled often, not as a guest of honor, but as a worker among workers, sleeves rolled up, teaching, listening, building. He stood in small town halls and sprawling urban centers alike, always carrying the same message. Your past is not your prison. Your future is built every day you refuse to give up. One particularly special evening, at the 5-year anniversary celebration of Second Light, Sundar attended as the guest of honor. He arrived quietly, without fanfare, slipping into the back of the room as hundreds of students and graduates shared their testimonies, how a simple chance had changed the course of their lives. When Sundar was eventually invited to speak, he stood before the crowd with uncharacteristic emotion shimmering in his eyes. I once met a young man who thought he was too broken to dream again, Sundar said, his voice steady but thick with feeling. Today, that same man has given thousands of others the courage to dream. That is the true mark of greatness, not what we achieve for ourselves, but what we inspire in others. The room erupted into applause, but Arjun, standing off to the side, did not bask in it. He simply smiled, feeling a deep, abiding peace settle within him. When he finally presented his solution, a clever combination of pre-caching essential resources and reducing unnecessary server calls, the team leads were astonished. It was elegant, practical, and most importantly, it worked. The prototype shaved loading times by over 30% in low-bandwidth environments, a change that not only improved user experience, but potentially opened the app to millions of underserved customers around the globe. Recognition came swiftly, but Arjun accepted the praise with quiet humility, knowing that true achievement was not in the accolades, but in the impact of the work itself. As weeks turned into months, Arjun's role expanded. He was trusted with more complex projects, invited into strategic meetings where his voice began to carry real weight. He began mentoring newer hires, many of whom struggled with the same self-doubt that had once nearly drowned him. He shared not just technical knowledge but life lessons, about resilience, about asking for help without shame, about the power of seeing oneself not through the lens of past failures but future possibilities. One day, after a particularly grueling sprint to launch a major update, Arjun received an invitation that made his hands tremble anew. Sundar Pichai had personally invited him to speak at a leadership event, not as a subject of charity or nostalgia, but as a symbol of perseverance and transformation. The event was to be attended by executives, entrepreneurs, and young professionals from all over the world, a stage so massive it dwarfed anything Arjun had ever dared to imagine. Standing backstage before his speech, Arjun felt the old fear rise again. The fear of not being enough. The fear of failing spectacularly in front of all these polished, brilliant minds. But he remembered Sundar's face at the graduation, the quiet nod of approval, and he remembered his own journey. Not a straight line, but a jagged, rugged climb filled with falls and bruises and aching, stubborn hope. When he finally stepped onto the stage, The bright lights momentarily blinded him. He took a deep breath, steadied his racing heart, and began to speak, not with the polished eloquence of a career politician, but with the raw, honest voice of someone who had lived every word he spoke. He told them about growing up with dusty shoes and empty pockets, about the cruelty of small humiliations and the heavier cruelty of self-doubt. He spoke about the kindness of one man who had refused to let his past define him and about the power hidden in a simple act of faith. He spoke not as a victim or a hero, but as a traveler still walking, still climbing. When he finished, the hall erupted in a standing ovation, but the real reward was the tearful faces in the crowd. Young men and women who saw in his story a reflection of their own silent struggles, who now believed that if he could rise, so could they. Later that evening, as the stars stretched silently across the velvet sky, Sundar found him sitting quietly on a terrace overlooking the city. They sat together, two men bound not by old wounds but by the journey beyond them, by the shared understanding that true leadership was not about the crowns you wore, but the hands you extended to lift others. "You've come a long way, Arjun," Sundar said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Arjun smiled, the lines around his eyes deepened by the road he had traveled, and replied, "I'm just getting started." And somewhere deep inside, he knew it was true. The boy who had once been shoved into the dirt had not just risen. He had learned to soar. The circle of giving. In the months following his speech, Arjun's life blossomed in ways he could have scarcely imagined. The applause that had thundered through the conference hall was not just a momentary echo. It had ignited a chain reaction. Invitations poured in, to speak at schools, to mentor young professionals, to participate in community panels discussing access to technology for underprivileged populations. But amid the whirlwind of recognition and new opportunities, Arjun remained anchored by a truth more vital than any applause. Success meant little if it was not shared. He remembered too clearly the lonely nights, the rejections, the aching hunger for a single hand to reach out in faith. It became clear to him that he was not merely meant to climb higher for his own sake. He was meant to build ladders for others who still stood in the shadows, looking up with tired eyes and battered hopes. He spoke passionately about his projects, about the real people they helped, about the sleepless nights spent wrestling with code, not because he had to, but because he believed in what he was building. And for the first time, he saw something different in the interviewer's eyes, not polite dismissal, but real interest, even admiration. 2 days later, Arjun received the offer letter. He stared at it for a long time, scarcely believing it was real. A full-time position, decent pay, benefits he had only dreamed of. It was not a glamorous job, not a position that would make headlines, but it was honest, stable, and most importantly, it was earned. As he signed his name on the dotted line, Arjun felt a surge of emotion so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. This was not a gift. It was not charity. It was the reward for every sleepless night, every swallowed fear, every stubborn refusal to give up when the world had told him to quit. He thought back to Sundar, to that rainy day, to the card slid silently across the counter, to the words spoken without judgment or pride. "If you ever want a second chance, call me." It was not just a second chance Sundar had given him. It was the belief that no past mistake could define his future, that the human spirit, when fueled by courage and kindness, could rebuild even the most shattered dreams. And now, with trembling but unbreakable hands, Arjun had opened the door to his new life, not by waiting for someone to let him in, but by building the entrance himself, the rise of a new chapter. The first day Arjun walked into his new workplace, he felt a mixture of pride and terror swirling within him. The building was modest compared to the glittering towers of Silicon Valley giants, but to Arjun, it was a palace, a fortress built from perseverance and second chances. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood, and the walls displayed not sterile corporate art, but vibrant murals celebrating creativity and innovation. His badge, clipped awkwardly to the pocket of his neatly pressed shirt, felt like a medal he had earned on the invisible battlefields of doubt and despair. As he was led through the bright, open-plan office space, introduced to teams, and assigned a small but functional workspace, Arjun's heart pounded with a steady rhythm. You are here. You deserve this. You fought for this. The work was demanding from the start. Arjun had entered the company's product development division as a junior software associate, a role that placed him at the very beginning of a ladder he hoped desperately to climb. His first tasks were humble: debugging old code, assisting in minor updates to the company's mobile app, sitting in on long meetings where he understood only half the jargon swirling around him. There were moments when he felt like a tourist in a foreign country, struggling to grasp the language and customs of a land he had fought so hard to enter. But Arjun had long since made peace with struggle. It was a familiar companion, and he welcomed its presence as a sign that he was moving forward. His colleagues, initially polite but distant, soon began to notice the same qualities that had carried him through the apprenticeship program. Arjun approached every task, no matter how small, with a fierce commitment to excellence. He stayed late without being asked, studying system architecture, teaching himself new frameworks, offering help to anyone who needed an extra hand. He asked questions, not to expose others' mistakes, but to genuinely understand and improve. Slowly, the invisible walls that separated the newcomer from the team began to crumble. Coffee break conversations became invitations to brainstorm sessions. Quick hallway nods became genuine discussions about projects and goals. It was during one such late-night session, when most of the office had emptied into the cool embrace of twilight, that Arjun's true breakthrough came. The company had been struggling with a persistent issue. Their flagship app suffered from slow loading times in rural areas where internet connectivity was poor. Several solutions had been proposed and discarded. Arjun, recalling the days of patchy internet back in Chennai, understood this problem in a way that data analytics could not capture. Drawing on his personal experiences, he stayed up night after night, sketching ideas, testing lightweight code modifications, imagining himself as the user he once had been. A young boy squinting at a flickering screen, hoping for one page to load. Interviews were even harder. Sitting in stark conference rooms or staring into his cheap laptop's flickering webcam, Arjun would answer technical questions with all the knowledge he had fought so hard to gain, but his lack of real-world experience betrayed him. Employers, wary and hurried, seemed unwilling to take a risk on a man who was older than the other applicants, whose resume bore more gaps than titles, whose life before tech whispered of mistakes and broken paths. Each polite dismissal left him a little more hollow, a little more questioning whether he had ever truly belonged in this world of polished presentations and rapid innovation. The weight of it gnawed at his spirit. He would return to his small apartment late in the evenings, shoulders slumped, hands aching from typing, and sit by the window where the city lights blurred into watery stars. There were moments, terrible moments, when he considered giving up, returning to the diner, asking for his old job back, slipping quietly into the life he had fought so hard to leave behind. Pride battled exhaustion inside him like twin storms. Was it better to cling stubbornly to a sinking dream or to accept the comfort, however bitter, of surrender? It was in one of those dark hours that he found himself, almost without realizing it, dialing Sundar's number again. His hands trembled not with fear, but with shame. The shame of admitting that he was struggling, that even after all the help, he might still fail. But Sundar answered, as he always did, with a calm patience that seemed almost sacred. They met not at Google's towering offices, but at a small community park, under a sky soft with the fading light of afternoon. Sundar sat on a worn bench, dressed simply, looking less like a titan of industry and more like an old friend who had been waiting all along. Arjun slumped onto the bench beside him, not knowing where to begin. For a long time, they simply sat in silence, listening to the rustle of the trees, the distant laughter of children playing. Finally, Arjun spoke, voice low and raw. "I don't think anyone's ever going to hire me. he said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Sundar turned to him, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened into something fiercely compassionate. "You're trying to open the wrong doors," Sundar said quietly. "Maybe it's time to build your own." The words puzzled Arjun at first, like a riddle. But as Sundar explained, a new idea began to take root. If the companies he was applying to could not see his potential, perhaps it was time for Arjun to create something they could not ignore. A portfolio, real, living proof of his skills, not just class projects, but tangible, useful work that showed creativity, resilience, and a deep understanding of what technology could do to solve real-world problems. Under Sundar's gentle encouragement, Arjun crafted a new plan. He would build applications, not for clients or employers, but for the community around him. Simple tools, a free scheduling app for the diner staff where he used to work, a local business directory for small shops in his neighborhood struggling after the pandemic, an online homework help site for kids in low-income families who had limited access to tutors. These were not glamorous projects, but they were real, raw, needed. They were proof that he could not only code, but that he could understand the human problems technology was meant to solve. The work was grueling. Without the structure of a classroom, Arjun had to impose discipline on himself, setting brutal deadlines, learning new skills on the fly, solving problems late into the night. There were days when the code refused to cooperate, when the website layouts broke in unpredictable ways, when bugs nested themselves deep within his projects like mischievous ghosts. But now, failure did not crush him. It sharpened him. Every error message was a lesson. Every broken feature was a challenge to rise above. Slowly, his portfolio grew, not sleek and corporate, but alive with heart and humanity. He documented each project meticulously, explaining not just how he built them, but why. Employers who had once overlooked him began to notice the applications he shared on his newly crafted LinkedIn profile. They saw not just a man with a certificate, but a creator who understood how to blend technology with empathy. One afternoon, after months of tireless work, Arjun received an email that nearly made him drop his coffee. A mid-sized tech company, known for valuing community-driven initiatives, had seen his portfolio and wanted to invite him for an interview. This time, when he walked into the meeting, he carried not just a piece of paper listing his skills, but a body of work that spoke louder than any words. It wasn't long before Arjun found a mentor within the program, a woman named Priya, a former engineer who had herself clawed her way up from poverty. Priya saw something of her own younger self in Arjun, and she took him under her wing, spending long hours after class walking him through concepts, challenging him with extra projects, pushing him beyond what he thought he could handle. Under her guidance, Arjun's world slowly expanded. He began to see the logic behind the code, the beauty in solving puzzles, the creative possibilities in technology. What had once seemed like an impenetrable wall now looked more like a mountain. Daunting, yes, but climbable, one step at a time. However, not all battles were fought in the classroom. Arjun's past continued to haunt him, whispering in moments of weakness that he would never truly change, that he was a fraud pretending to belong among dreamers. There were moments, especially late at night, when he questioned if he was simply delaying the inevitable, if failure was written into his very DNA. Yet every time those doubts threatened to consume him, he would think back to the rainy afternoon at the diner, to Sundar's outstretched hand, and the look in his eyes that said, "I believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself." Bit by bit, Arjun learned to silence the voices of fear with action. He built his first real website, clunky, imperfect, but entirely his own. He completed his first group project, presenting it in front of the class with shaking hands, but a steady voice. He volunteered to lead a small team, fumbling at first, but gradually growing into a leader who listened, adapted, inspired. He began to dream again, cautiously at first, then with a hunger he had almost forgotten he possessed. It took 6 long, grueling months, but Arjun graduated from the program, not at the top of his class, but with something far more valuable, a hard-earned confidence, a set of real skills, and a belief that he could build a future with his own hands. On graduation day, as he stood among the other students in the sunlit courtyard, holding his certificate, he spotted Sundar in the crowd. Their eyes met across the distance. No words needed. Sundar gave a simple, proud nod, and Arjun felt a lump rise in his throat. This was not the end of the journey, not even close. It was merely the end of the beginning. Arjun knew that ahead lay job interviews, rejections, challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But now he carried something no one could take away. Not the world, not circumstance, not even the shadows of his own past. He carried within him a fire, forged from struggle, stoked by forgiveness, and kept alive by the unyielding truth that the human spirit, once awakened, could survive anything. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Arjun walked home with his certificate tucked under his arm and a future stretching wide and open before him. Behind him, the old ghosts faded into the twilight. Ahead of him, possibility beckoned, fierce, endless, and real. And this time, he was ready. The doors that would not open. The certificate Arjun carried home that day felt like more than just a piece of paper. It was a key, heavy and gleaming, promising entrance to a world he had once believed forever closed to him. Yet he soon discovered that holding a key and finding the right door were two very different challenges. Armed with a newfound sense of purpose and a fragile hope that flickered within him, Arjun began the arduous process of job hunting. In his mind, he pictured a swift transformation, walking into interviews, impressing hiring managers, starting fresh in an entry-level tech position where he could begin building his new life. But reality, as it so often does, proved harsher than dreams. Each morning, he meticulously combed through job boards, crafting personalized resumes and heartfelt cover letters. He filled applications with trembling fingers, each submission carrying a piece of his battered hope. He tailored his words carefully, highlighting his newly acquired skills, his completed projects, his relentless work ethic. Yet despite the effort, the replies, when they came at all, were brutally short. "Thank you for your application. We have decided to move forward with other candidates." Rejection after rejection piled up like invisible bricks, slowly constructing a wall that loomed higher with every passing week. He listened not as a CEO, not as a man seeking repayment for past hurts, but as an old acquaintance who understood the frailty of human dreams. Arjun spoke hesitantly at first, then with growing urgency, as the dam inside him broke. He spoke of the bad choices, the jobs he lost, the marriage that crumbled under the weight of poverty and pride, the loneliness that clawed at him night after night. Sundar never interrupted, never judged. He simply absorbed every word, as though honoring the pain it carried. When Arjun finished, slumping back in his chair, exhausted, Sundar finally spoke. "Your story isn't over," he said simply. "Not if you don't want it to be." He explained an idea, not a handout, but an opportunity. Google ran community outreach programs, training initiatives for underprivileged adults seeking new careers in technology, coding boot camps, project management apprenticeships, customer support training. They were rigorous, demanding, but they were also doorways, waiting for those brave enough to walk through. "I can recommend you," Sundar said, "but you'll have to do the work. No shortcuts, no easy wins." Arjun blinked back tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming, bewildering hope. "I'll do anything," he whispered. Sundar smiled, the kind of smile that contained lifetimes of understanding. "I believe you," he said. That night, as Arjun left the Google campus under the velvet cloak of twilight, he carried something he hadn't felt in years. Not money, not fame, not even certainty, but hope. Raw, trembling, radiant hope. And in the quiet spaces of his heart, a promise formed, not to Sundar, not even to the world, but to himself. He would rise. He would rebuild. and he would never again squander a second chance. The fire of struggle. The days that followed were some of the hardest Arjun had ever lived through. When he first stepped into the modest classroom where the Google apprenticeship program was held, he was overwhelmed by a wave of insecurity, so strong that it nearly sent him fleeing back into the shadows of his old life. The room was filled with people younger than him, sharper, seemingly more suited for the world of code and systems and data. They carried laptops plastered with stickers, spoke fluently in a language of software he barely understood, and typed at speeds that made his heart sink. In contrast, Arjun's hands worn from years of manual work, felt clumsy, foreign on the keyboard. Every small mistake, every confused glance at the instructor, felt like a neon sign flashing over his head. "You don't belong here." But Arjun remembered Sundar's words, echoing in the quiet of his mind. No shortcuts, no easy wins. And somewhere deep inside him, buried under layers of regret and fear, something stirred, a stubbornness, a will to prove, not to the world, but to himself, that he was more than the sum of his past failures. So he gritted his teeth, forced down the rising tide of self-doubt, and plunged into the unfamiliar waters of coding languages, project deadlines, group presentations, and late-night study marathons. The first few weeks were brutal. HTML, CSS, JavaScript. The words sounded alien, almost mocking. He struggled to keep up, falling behind in assignments, stumbling through basic concepts that others seemed to grasp effortlessly. There were nights when he stared at the flickering screen of his borrowed laptop until his vision blurred, his head pounding with frustration. There were mornings when the thought of facing another day of failure made him physically sick. Yet, even in those darkest hours, Arjun refused to let go of the fragile thread of hope Sundar had handed him. Each morning, he woke up with a simple vow: just one more step, just one more try. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, things began to shift. Small victories came. A line of code that finally worked, a project completed without errors, a word of encouragement from an instructor. Arjun discovered that while he might not be the fastest, he had something many of his peers lacked, an almost ferocious resilience, honed by years of surviving storms. He learned to ask questions without shame, to accept failure as part of the learning process, to celebrate progress no matter how tiny. His classmates began to notice him, not as the awkward older man fumbling at the edges, but as a determined fighter who refused to give up. Meanwhile, Sundar kept a quiet eye on Arjun's journey. Though his schedule was a whirlwind of meetings, decisions, and travel, he made time to check on the progress reports from the apprenticeship program. He read them carefully, smiling at the notes. Arjun is showing great improvement in problem-solving skills, excellent teamwork, and perseverance. Each update was a small beacon of proof that even broken paths could be mended with enough courage. "It's okay," Sundar said, his voice steady. "We were kids. We all make mistakes." Arjun's eyes filled with tears. He looked down, ashamed. "Life, it didn't turn out the way I thought it would." Sundar felt a pang of something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, not vindication, but compassion. "Maybe," Sundar said gently, "it's not too late to turn it around." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a business card, and slid it across the counter. "If you ever want a second chance," Sundar said, smiling, "call me." And with that, he turned, leaving a stunned Arjun holding a lifeline he never thought he'd be offered. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world, somehow, seemed a little brighter. The weight of redemption. The days following that unexpected encounter at the diner left a mark on Sundar's heart that he could not ignore. Even amid board meetings, product launches, and global strategy discussions, his mind would often wander back to that small, rain-soaked afternoon. He had built an empire, crossed continents, and entered rooms that his younger self could have only dreamt of. Yet there was something profoundly humbling about meeting Arjun in such a fragile state. It forced him to confront a truth he rarely dwelled upon: that success, no matter how grand, was never solely a matter of personal brilliance. It was often intertwined with grace, mercy, and the silent prayers of those who loved us. For Arjun, that single business card burned a hole in his pocket for days. He stared at it during his late-night shifts, the cheap fluorescent lights buzzing above him, the hollow clatter of dirty plates piling around. His life had unraveled quietly over the years. Bad decisions, missed opportunities, pride that hardened into regret. There had been dreams once, a vision of studying further, of starting a business, of escaping the small world that had both comforted and confined him. But somewhere along the line, the fire dimmed. Mistakes mounted. And now, here he was, a cashier, invisible behind a counter, watching a stream of strangers pass him by every day, none of whom saw the man he used to be or the boy he had hoped to become. Every night, Arjun wrestled with shame. The thought of calling Sundar, the very boy he had once tormented, gnawed at him. What right did he have to ask for help from someone he had hurt so thoughtlessly? Would Sundar laugh at him now, as Arjun had once laughed at his torn school shoes and quiet voice? Or worse, would he simply forget, dismiss him as a relic of a painful past, no longer worth his time? But deeper still was another fear, more paralyzing than pride. The fear that maybe, just maybe, Sundar had meant what he said. That he truly was offering a second chance, and if that was true, could Arjun live with himself if he was too afraid to take it? One evening, after another grueling 12-hour shift, Arjun sat alone in the back room of the diner, the business card trembling in his calloused fingers. His thumb traced over the embossed letters. Sundar Pichai, Chief Executive Officer. It felt almost absurd, surreal, as though the universe had played a strange joke. A man who had risen to unimaginable heights offering a lifeline to someone drowning in anonymity. With a deep breath that seemed to pull from the bottom of his soul, Arjun pulled out his cracked old phone, hesitated for a long moment, then dialed the number. The call was answered on the second ring. "Hello, this is Sundar." The voice was calm, warm, exactly as Arjun remembered, and yet not at all the same. It was the voice of a man who had carried dreams across oceans, who had walked through storms and emerged stronger. For a few seconds, Arjun couldn't speak. His throat tightened painfully. "Sundar, it's Arjun," he finally croaked out, his voice hoarse with emotion. There was a pause on the other end, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. "I'm glad you called," Sundar said gently. And just like that, a bridge between past and present began to form. They arranged to meet again, this time not by accident, but by choice. Sundar invited Arjun to Google's headquarters, not as a VIP guest, not as a charity case, but as a man who deserved dignity. As Arjun stood at the towering glass doors of the Googleplex, heart hammering against his ribs, he realized how deeply he had underestimated the simple, quiet power of forgiveness. Inside, Sundar greeted him personally, dressed not in the intimidating armor of a corporate giant, but in a simple sweater and jeans, approachable, human. He led Arjun through the vibrant, colorful halls of innovation, a world that thrived on ideas, on second chances, on the belief that where you start does not have to dictate where you finish. Over coffee, real coffee, not the diner sludge Arjun was used to. Sundar listened. The seeds of the past. There's a saying that time heals all wounds, but some scars stay hidden, buried under the surface, until fate has a curious way of bringing them back into the light. Long before he was the CEO of one of the world's most influential technology companies, Sundar Pichai was just a young boy growing up in a modest two-room apartment in Chennai, India. His world was small, bound by the narrow streets, crowded markets, and sun-drenched afternoons that seemed to stretch endlessly. His parents, modest and hardworking, taught him the values of humility, perseverance, and kindness. Education, they believed, was the golden bridge to a better life. Sundar was not the loudest or the most confident boy in his class. He was thin, wore oversized hand-me-downs, and had a quiet, thoughtful demeanor that made him an easy target for bullies. While some classmates found friends in laughter and games, Sundar often found solace in books, in mathematics, and in the wonder of how things worked, especially gadgets like the rotary telephone his family treasured. Among those who taunted him, there was one boy who stood out, Arjun. Arjun was everything Sundar wasn't. Tall, athletic, brimming with energy and arrogance, Arjun commanded attention wherever he went. He would tease Sundar ruthlessly, mocking his quiet nature, his worn-out shoes, his frayed school-bag. Sometimes the bullying was verbal, sharp words, cruel jokes. Other times it was physical, shoving in the hallways, stolen notebooks, and once a hard shove that sent Sundar sprawling into the dirt. But Sundar said nothing. He carried the bruises, physical and emotional, like hidden badges. At night, he would sit on the rooftop of their tiny apartment, stare at the endless stars above, and dream. He dreamed not of revenge, but of something far greater, a future where he would build, create, and prove that kindness could outlast cruelty. Years passed. High school ended. Sundar, armed with sheer brilliance and relentless determination, earned a place at the prestigious Indian Institute of Technology, IIT, Kharagpur. From there, his path led him overseas, a scholarship to Stanford University, and later an MBA from the Wharton School. With each step, he moved further from the dusty streets of Chennai, from the echoes of laughter that once haunted him. And as Sundar rose, first joining Google as a product manager, then leading the development of Chrome, and eventually ascending to the position of CEO, he believed he had left that chapter behind. In his mind, Arjun became just a faded character in a distant story, irrelevant to the life he now led. Or so he thought. It was a rainy afternoon in San Francisco when the past came calling. Sundar was running late for a meeting. Traffic had snarled up unexpectedly, and his driver took a detour, winding through unfamiliar streets. As they waited at a red light, Sundar spotted a small, unassuming diner on the corner. His stomach grumbled. He hadn't eaten since morning, and on impulse, he asked the driver to pull over. The diner was warm, the smell of fresh coffee and fried food filling the air. It wasn't the kind of place a CEO usually dined at, but today, Sundar didn't care. He just needed a break. He walked up to the counter, scanning the laminated menu, when a voice, low, tired, and strangely familiar, said, "What can I get you?" Sundar looked up, and his heart stopped. Behind the counter, wearing a faded apron and a name tag that read Arjun, was the boy who had once made his life miserable. But Arjun was no longer the cocky teenager Sundar remembered. His face was worn, lined with hardship. His shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. His eyes, once sharp and mocking, now seemed dulled by years of struggle. For a moment, neither man spoke. The past, heavy and undeniable, hung in the space between them. Then Arjun, not recognizing Sundar yet, repeated, "What can I get you?" Sundar's mind raced. He could walk away. He could confront him. He could do 100 things. Instead, he smiled gently, a smile that carried no malice, no revenge, and said, "Just a coffee, please." Arjun nodded, moving mechanically, pouring the coffee with a shaky hand. As he placed the cup on the counter, their eyes met again. And this time, recognition flickered. "Wait." Arjun's voice trembled. "Are you Sundar?" Sundar simply nodded. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry," Arjun blurted out suddenly, the words spilling out in a rush. "For everything. I was young. Stupid. I didn't know what I was doing." Sundar said nothing for a moment, just studied the man before him. He thought of all the nights he had cried in secret, the years he had struggled to believe he was enough. And then he said the most unexpected thing.